All right, I am so honored today to have the opportunity to introduce Charles Catania. Charles Catania is Professor Emeritus at UMBC, is past president of ABAI and of Division 25 of the American Psychological Association. He has served as editor of the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. He had the good fortune to start his career in 1954 in Fred Keller's introductory psychology course at Columbia, and later to serve as teaching assistant in Nate Schoenfeld experimental psychology sequence. He earned his PhD at Harvard, where he conducted postdoctoral research in B.F. Skinner's Pigeon Laboratory. After a brief stint in psychopharmacology, he moved to the University Heights campus of New York University, and then to UMBC, where he maintained a pigeon laboratory with Elliot Shimoff, also a Columbia product. In his research, he has focused both on nonverbal behavior as it is engendered and maintained by fundamental behavioral processes, and on the special properties of verbal behavior that depend on those fundamental processes. His service as director of an applied behavior analysis master's track at UMBC allowed him to explore relations between basic and applied areas in our field. His latest book is The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. Please join me in welcoming Charles Catania.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Okay, here we go. Well, look at the title there, Stimulus Control, Implications for Verbal Behavior, Social Contingencies in Education. You see, the title Stimulus Control was supposed to be one that would be a little bit less off-putting and daunting than the topic that I'm going to be talking about, which is the topic of discrimination. And the word discrimination is a word that we behavior analysts use all the time as a technical term. You discriminate between this and that. The pigeon learns to discriminate between green keys and red keys. But what I will be doing here today is trying to take you on a journey in which we explore the relevance of that sense of discrimination for discrimination as we understand it in other places. So I wanted to put in a title that wasn't so controversial, but actually that term control and stimulus control, back in the days when Skinner was starting to write about things, people interpreted the word control not in the experimental sense that, you control conditions in the laboratory to make sure you can figure out what's going on. You have your control conditions and your regular conditions. But it became, this is the stuff that's going to control everybody's behavior, and we've got to worry about it, and this is evil stuff. So I put that in the title instead. Talk about trying to avoid controversy. Here we are. I'm going to just move ahead to the next slide. This is an abstract. I put it in here not because I plan to go through the abstract, but because you will then have it within the stuff that you download if you download the slides. And the same is sort of true of the next one, which is a kind of a rough outline. This is a set of the topics. We'll be talking about stimulus control, which is equivalent to the topic of discrimination learning. I'll be talking about some of my personal history, and then we'll be talking about the history of this concept and how it developed over time. I'll be talking about the ways in which attention is a crucial part of it. I'll be relating this to the whole business of selection. We select behavior. We arrange consequences for behavior that makes the behavior more likely to occur. That's a kind of selection, just like Darwin's natural selection is selection as it works in the evolution of species over phylogenetic time. If we're going to talk about that, we have to talk about classes of behavior. We have to talk about a whole lot of other things. And in the end, if we're going to really extend this stuff out to human behavior, we've got to talk a little about verbal behavior. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. You folks should start looking restless after about the first hour and 15 minutes, and that might be the sign that it's time to take a break. We will take a break later on. Ashley mentioned my recent book, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. The thing that I like about it is this is an introductory textbook for behavior analysis. It's not a psychology textbook about behavior analysis, which is part of a psychology curriculum. No, this is our science now. And this book is the basics of this science, whether you're an undergraduate coming into the field or you're a new graduate student and you want to learn about behavior analysis. And the other thing is that in it I do have a couple of chapters which are actually the inspiration for doing this talk, in which I discuss discrimination and prejudice in the social senses and how they relate to our fundamental concepts. Well, so let's get around a little bit to what discrimination is about. If you have a pigeon in a little chamber and the light on the pigeon key comes on green and you fix it so that when the pigeon pecks that key, a little bit of food is delivered, and then you change the light to red, and during that time, if the pigeon pecks, nothing happens, that pigeon is pretty soon going to learn to peck green and not red. And it does so because there are different consequences. So the basics of this concept of discrimination involve what we call the three-term contingency. The three terms are the A's, the antecedents, the B's, the behavior, and the C's, the consequences. It should be as easy as ABC, right? In the presence of stimulus 1, response 1 may produce some kind of consequence. In the presence of stimulus 2, some other response may produce a different consequence. And when we see different kinds of behavior in the presence of S1 or S2, we say that this individual is discriminating between A and B. And that word, of course, is not so different from the everyday thing. Now, how did I get involved in all of this? Well, Ashley mentioned that I took introductory psychology. You gave away the how long ago that was. This is the spring semester of Fred Keller's introductory psych course, in which the introductory psych course that I took when I was an undergraduate, the fall semester was a rat lab, the spring semester was a human lab. This is a picture from the human lab in the spring semester. This is Fred Keller, who wrote the textbook that I used as an undergraduate. This is Nat Schoenfeld, who then was the teacher of the experimental psych course that I'll mention in a couple of minutes. I don't know the name of this teaching assistant, but this was my lab partner. I only discovered this picture about 5 or 10 years ago. That's me, actually, way back then. Okay, and that's one of the very rare occasions, like this one today, in which I wore a tie as an undergraduate. And I'm wearing one today too. That's also rare. In that course, we learned about discrimination. In fact, in the fall semester, we had rats learning to discriminate light on from light off. And it took a long time for rats to learn that. It wasn't until much later, when I started to work with pigeons, I discovered that discriminations, you can just create them very quickly. It's a common kind of thing. I was also, when I was an undergraduate in those days, living in New York City, grew up in New York City, and I was trying to make ends meet. During the summer, I had a summer job over several, actually 3 or 4 years. I used to work summers in Harlem Hospital. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I grew up in a diverse ethnic neighborhood in which the Irish lived over here and the Greeks lived over here and the Italians lived over here. And this was the sort of an intersection, but it was pretty much racially homogeneous. But during the summers, I was the only white kid working temporary shifts at Harlem Hospital. And so I was learning a little bit about discrimination in a different way from the ways I was learning it in my courses. And it was only years later that I began to realize that some of what I was doing then and some of what I'm doing in the academic way really do relate to each other. And I do plan to address that. Here are my two teachers, Nat Schoenfeld and Fred Keller, without whom I'm sure I wouldn't be here, because they took Skinner's work, they created an undergraduate curriculum based upon it. One of my great privileges was later I helped to get Fred Keller's autobiography published. This is a copy of it. And it was in the course of doing that I discovered the picture I showed you just a little bit ago. Then I went on to graduate school at Harvard Memorial Hall. This was the building in the basement of which were the labs. We graduate students were competitive. We'd be working all the time. And then on weekends, we'd be trying to work down there. And one of the areas directly above where the psychology labs were was a big auditorium in which they occasionally had square dances. And so you can imagine if you're trying to review for an exam that was going to come up the next day and they were having a square dance overhead and all the light fixtures were bouncing up and down. It was interesting times. But we worked with these little chambers in which you could put a pigeon, and you can't see it particularly well, but up there on the wall is a little disc the pigeon could peck. Here's a thing that lifted food. This was a small chamber inside a much bigger soundproof one. Later on, I ended up being able to do that kind of work here with my late colleague Elliot Shimoff when he and I were doing teaching together, teaching undergraduate classes. We would often demonstrate discriminations and the reversal of discrimination. So we would start out having a fight with respect to this because Elliot would be working with a pigeon that had been set up by the teaching assistant, or rather, I would be working with a pigeon set up by a teaching assistant, and the pigeon had been taught to peck green but not to peck red but not green. Pecks on red were paying off, pecks on green were not doing anything. And this pigeon's pecking when it comes up red, stopping when it comes up green. Elliot is standing with his back to me and is lecturing to the class, and he says, well, I might as well keep it mnemonically simple. On green you go and on red you stop. So even without looking at that pigeon, I should be able to tell you what's going on. Except he's saying on green the pigeon should go, and I've got the pigeon stopping on green. And so we end up in a fight that we've set up about who's responsible. The teaching assistant says, I don't want to have any part of this. The students claim they knew we were kidding, but we have reason to believe that wasn't the case. But anyway, then I take on the dare. I said, okay, you want me to fix it? I'll turn it around. And we could, in the matter of 5 or 10 minutes, using the onset of first reinforcing pecks in the presence of green, so the pigeon is now pecking green again, but it's still pecking red. And then whenever the bird slows down just a little bit during red and moves its beak away from the key, you turn it back to green. Well, if now pecks on green are producing food a lot, pretty soon the pigeon is backing off the red key and it turns on green. And in about 5 or 10 minutes, you can get this pigeon who started out doing terrible traffic things, going on red and stopping on green, and now get it to behave appropriately so it doesn't get too many traffic tickets. And then, of course, we admitted to the class that we faked it, and they all said, of course, we knew that you were. So that's a little bit of the background. So here we are. We're talking about this term discrimination in the technical sense, in which we've talked about it over the years. But we have to then move on to talking about the other kinds of discrimination. Does our science have anything to say that can contribute to the way our culture, and particularly the American culture, looks at these kinds of things? Then, later on, we're going to worry about prejudice as well. Prejudice is different, and it turns out that if you're prejudiced, that's short for prejudgment. It does imply that you're behaving differently with respect to some people or some things than you are with respect to other things, but it's not something that you learned in direct interactions. It's something that you learned based on a verbal history. You know, as the song goes, you have to be carefully taught to hate all the people your relatives hate. That's the song out of South Pacific that I'll mention later on. Okay, so this is that 3-term contingency, right? It's in the presence of one stimulus, you do one thing. In the presence of another stimulus, you do another thing. I'm going to give you a few examples of other experimental things that we've done in various ways in the laboratory that are relevant to this topic of stimulus control or discrimination learning. The example I'm going to use first is one of breast self-examination. This is a picture of data that were obtained by Hank Pennypacker and a number of his colleagues. And the job, after all, that's a discrimination task too. If you're a woman, also, by the way, without regard to gender, men also are subject to breast cancer. It occurs much less frequently, but they should be able to tell the difference too. whether something they feel in their own bodies is something that a doctor ought to look at or not. And that is not something that we're just simply born to do. It turns out, even with respect to something that we think should be something everybody ought to know, we are all intimately connected with our own bodies, but it turns out that for this kind of discrimination, you got to be taught. You got to be taught about it. So what Pennypacker did was a whole series of experiments in which there were artificial silicone models which had things embedded in them which were the kinds of nodules that if a doctor found them, the doctor would want to get a biopsy and see what was going on. One of the things that one is concerned about there is not simply knowing what these nodules feel like, but also how you check. And so he and his group began to do experiments using the standard kinds of methods of checking that had been around for years. Now, the one that was around by the National Cancer Society back in the old days was a spiral search. And in fact, that was the kind of thing that was in all kinds of literature about how breast self-examination would be done. But he also wanted to look at radial search and grid search. And it turned out that by putting a finger, a little lamp on the finger of somebody who is checking out some of these artificial targets, that they could also get a picture of just how much area was explored and therefore make an estimate of which kind of search was the most effective. Well, it turns out that the radial search, in which you go back and forth in a grid, produced far more hits, far more occasions in which people reported finding one of these artificial lumps than did either the radial search or the standard concentric search. And in fact, the data was such that that the American Cancer Society actually for a while there was coming out with recommendations that this was the preferable method of search. Unfortunately, mass studies in which lots of women were trained on the different kinds of things were never conducted. And in recent years, actually, they've reverted to saying, oh, well, as long as you do some kind of research, some kind of search, it's better than nothing, which is true. But it still remains the case that all the data suggests that this is it. Now, why do I bring up this kind of example? It allows me to talk about a couple of things important with respect to discrimination. This sort of discrimination allows us to talk in terms of signal detection. This was a thing that came out of experimental psychology, people studying sensory things. In signal detection, you have a target that you're asked to detect embedded in noise, or you have just the noise all by itself, and you either say, yes, this target's been presented to me, or no, there's nothing there. Now, if those are the two possibilities, either you are presented with something, in this particular case, a lump is there that you ought to report, or there's nothing there, you can do one of two things. If something's there and you say that something's there, that's a correct positive or a hit. If something's there and you don't say it's there, you miss it, that's a miss. On the other hand, if nothing's there and you report it, that's a false alarm. A lot of things are going to follow from that. You're going to be worried. You're going to be reporting this thing. It'll be costly, but it was unnecessarily costly. Or you nothing was there and you said nothing was there, so you correctly rejected it. Now, the reason this stuff is important is that just about any discrimination you talk about has these differential payoffs. There are costs to getting it right, and there are costs to getting it wrong, and those costs differ depending upon which of these kinds of things you talk about. So, and this particular example is a particularly good one for discussing this, the breast self-examination example, because obviously missing a nodule that might potentially be malignant is a big deal. But it's also a big deal if somebody is told that something's wrong and nothing's wrong, and that's costly too. And one of the things is that the medical profession is often pushed back and forth. The medical profession is often more interested in the costs, and they really hate a lot of false alarms because they start costing the home medical system money, whereas obviously from the side of the patient, the one mistake you don't want to make is to miss something that ought to be detected. So these are some of the kinds of things that come out of this, and I want to make a couple of points about this study, a couple more points. This was research conducted by Hank Pennypacker, who began his career in behavior analysis working with pigeons. So he went from working with pigeons to working with this kind of a system. The data that have come out of this have undoubtedly saved lives, and have been used now in training doctors to do examinations as well as to train self-examination. So it's continuing the long tradition in behavior analysis of people who start in basic research and do applications. And although nowadays with a journal called the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, where there are people doing applied things, another journal called the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, where people do experimental things, it turns out that if you look at the history of the field right from the very beginning, the people who were doing the basic research were also doing applications. Charlie Ferster was doing experiments with schedules of reinforcement and produced the schedules of reinforcement with Skinner. But on the side, he was working with the children then called psychotic children. Turns out that Charlie Ferster's was the very first work that impressed psychiatrists. These children later came to be called the children on the autism spectrum. But Charlie Ferster, by just getting them to make simple responses like pushing a button when there was a little goodie as a payoff, demonstrated to psychiatrists that you could take these kids who were supposed to be isolated from the rest of the world and show they were sensitive to something that happened in the environment. These kids could make something happen. And that work by Charlie Ferster was the beginning of what's turned into what you now see going on in a place like this today. Charlie Ferster was a basic researcher, ran Skinner's Pigeon Lab, but was doing these other kinds of things. And you can go through other people. Nate Azrin doing a whole bunch of basic research, but also creating token economies. The applied and the basic stuff have been interwoven from time to time because of the problem of having a huge amount of stuff to deal with. For practical reasons, the two journals separated. And so I'm usually bemused and kind of bothered when people in the one field are saying, well, we really have to come back together because the fields always were together. It's part of one growing science. And no science that's worth its weight, that doesn't produce a whole batch of applications, should be taken too seriously. The reason behavior analysis must be taken seriously is because of the tremendous number of applications, not just the kinds of things we're concerned about here, but all over the place. The other reason I like this example is because it says that discriminating is not it's not that the stimulus is out there and you're sort of laying back and it comes and hits you and you then eventually react to it. No, to engage with the environment, you've got to do something. If you're going to do the breast self-examination, you've got to do the palpation. You can't find it unless you touch it, and touching is something you do. You don't hear things unless you listen to them. Listen for them. Listening for something is something you do. You see things by looking at them, and looking at them is something you do. So this is active stuff. It's not passive stuff. It's all part of behavior. And finally, it reminds us that even though these are all properties that we can respond to, we learn to respond to all sorts of things in the world, we mustn't assume that just because they're things that are parts of our own bodies, just because there are things we're close to in special ways, that we somehow know those better because they're part of us. No, even with respect to ourselves and our own bodies and our own behavior, we often have to be taught what's going on. Now let's talk a little bit about attention, okay? So as I've already been saying, to respond to things, you've got to be doing something with respect to them. Now, here's a quick little example. This is from an experiment involving pigeons in which these are two pigeons. There's bird 105 and bird 107. There actually weren't 107 pigeons in the lab. That was just the two numbers these guys happened to get. And this is an experiment by a guy named George Reynolds, who's a graduate student, a contemporary of mine. He had pigeon keys in which a triangle on a red background was one stimulus and a circle on a green background was the other stimulus. And that's true for both these birds. Triangle on red, if you peck that key, food comes. circle on green, if you peck that key, nothing happens. And pretty soon, as this graph shows, you get lots and lots of pecks given triangle on red. You get very few pecks giving circle on green. Now, these birds look exactly the same. You watch one of these birds going, and that one's pecking a lot given the one stimulus, not pecking a much given the other. Same is true of the other bird. But now what you do is you separate the stimuli out, and you present all by themselves the triangle or the red or the circle or the green. And look at how different these birds turn out to be. Bird 105 now pecks a lot whenever the triangle is there, and even though the triangle was always on red, when red comes up all by itself, it hardly pecks at all. This bird was attending only to form. It wasn't attending at all to color. Now, by attending there, I don't mean any movement it made. It wasn't like eye movements or anything like that. Its responding was determined for some reason or other. This bird was only attending to the triangles. This other bird, if the key was red, it pecked a lot. If the triangle came on, I mean, we're not surprised that it doesn't peck the other two stimuli because they were low in the original procedure anyway. This one is ignoring the shape and is attending only to color. So just because we see a stimulus there and we see an organism responding to it doesn't mean we can say that it's responding to all the features of the stimulus. There may be some pieces of it that it's selectively attending to, okay? We respond to people. There are some people who respond much more to the color of somebody's skin than the color of somebody's eyes or the color of somebody's hair. There are stimuli that have many, many dimensions, and we attend to some of these dimensions and not others. Now, if we consistently did experiments in which we provided reinforcers given triangles but not circles to both of these birds, presumably, assuming they didn't have some kind of peculiar visual defect or something like that, they'd both come to be attending, say, to shape if we wanted that to be the crucial dimension, or to color if we wanted that to be the crucial dimension. So this is key to our looking at what stimuli do when we talk about discrimination. Here's another experiment. This is one in which, with pigeons, the frequency of sound was varied. And this was by a researcher named Herb Jenkins. After he had training at one frequency, 1,000 cycles per second, in which pecks on that stimulus were reinforced, and then he presented higher and lower frequencies, the frequency didn't make any difference. You changed the frequency, the bird kept on pecking just as it had before. So you could say this bird was not paying any attention to the sounds. He did another experiment, however, in which he trained the pigeon to peck when this stimulus was on, and if there was no sound, the birds learned not to peck. Okay? That procedure forced the pigeon to attend to the presence versus the absence of sound. It forced the pigeons to attend to sound, and once the pigeons were attending to sound and had this kind of training, if he now presented other different frequencies, either lower or higher, the rate fell off. The more different from the training stimulus, the less the pigeon responded. So once you get attention, you also get attention to other features some of the time. I'll skip over the next stimulus, the next slide, which simply shows that the same is true for an extinction stimulus. Well, actually, I'll just say enough that with an extinction stimulus, then the further away you get from that, the more responding you get. Enough said about that. So with respect to these different kinds of stimuli, you have to be attending to them. Once you're attending to them, you can establish a discrimination in that you can create a set of contingencies which get the animal responding to these different stimuli. You can get rid of that by now presenting reinforcers in the presence of both stimuli. You can reverse it, as I mentioned that Shimov and I did in that classroom demonstration. You can also do one more thing, which is to create a conditional discrimination. I'll be coming back to that later because that has some special significance when we start extending that to talking about human social behavior. So as discrimination Depends on attention. What are a couple of other ways we can exploit that? Well, there are a set of procedures called feature positive versus feature negative. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And there are another set of experiments concerned with what we call observing responses. Let's first talk about the feature positive. Let's suppose you've got these two stimuli that alternate. On the left up there, you've got a stimulus which is a set of grids, squares, but one of them is a star. Okay. On the other side is a set of squares, but no star in it. Now let's suppose you fix it so that as long as a star is there, a peck on that key when that's what comes up will produce food. But if on the next trial what comes up is the grid without a star, pecks do nothing. Okay, so as you've got it there, here if there's a star, peck produces food. Here there's no star, peck produces no food. And what you do is, on successive trials, you change the position of the star. It moves around from one place to another. Okay? Pigeons very rapidly learn this. And in fact, if you go and you look at what they're doing inside the pigeon chamber, and you measure where they're pecking the key, they're pecking where the star is. They're actually pecking the star as it moves around. But then let's do the opposite. The star was the positive feature. It was the feature correlated with whether the peck was going to produce food. Now let's do it. Now in the bottom column there, we'll do it with the feature negative. Now we're reversing things. For the purposes of this kind of experiment, you'd want to take a brand new bunch of birds and do it with them. But in this case, if the grid is there with no star, peck produces food. But if there's a star there and the bird pecks, nothing happens. And under those circumstances, you move the star around, and you move the star around, and you move the star around. And you know what? Anybody, okay, how many people think the pigeon will learn that about as quickly as the pigeon learned the feature positive one? Maybe you folks have heard about this experiment before. No, the pigeon, how about think the pigeon will learn it more quickly? Okay, well, I won't even bother asking the last question. Yes, it takes a long time for the pigeon to learn the feature negative. And if you look at what the pigeon is doing, when it's pecking during the reinforcement thing, it's pecking on those squares and it's moving around, pecking at different times. But if you look at what it's doing when the other one comes up, it's moving its head away from the key. Because looking at a stimulus that's correlated with no food is not a very pleasant thing to do, presumably, if you don't mind the colloquialism. The star is not a reinforcing stimulus because it is correlated with no food being presented. And therefore, the pigeon tends not to look at it. And if the pigeon's not looking at it, then it's going to see the squares instead, and those squares look just like the squares in the other conditions, so it takes a long, long time for that rate difference to emerge. And sometimes it just never gets as good as it does for the feature positive birds. And the reason I mention this is that these two sets of conditions are equally informative. You know as much about which one's going to be the food stimulus and which one's going to be the extinction stimulus with one of these systems from the others. And the cognitive psychologists are always telling us that we're all information processors and we learn about things in the world because of the information that's in them. Well, these are equally informative, but why then does the pigeon learn one much more rapidly than the other? It's because we tend to look at the stimuli that are correlated with reinforcers. We tend not to look at the stimuli that are correlated with aversive events or with non-reinforcement. And that's a really important kind of thing for us to understand. Now, we could actually have both of these things going if we wanted to. And I mentioned earlier conditional discrimination. Conditional discrimination is a discrimination where, depending on some other additional stimulus, the discrimination changes. So, for example, if I had a light on the top of the pigeon's chamber and I had those experiments involving the circle and the triangle and the red and the green, I could set it up so that when the light is on, then I will reinforce the pigeon's pecks on the green but not the red. And when the light is off, I'll reinforce the pigeon's pecks on the triangle but not the circle. So by changing whether the chamber light is on or off, I could get the pigeon to attend either to color or to form. That's a conditional discrimination. Which one it attends to is conditional upon whether I turn on the light on the top of the chamber. Well, this example, supposing I light the key up either green or red, And if I light it up green, then in the presence of green, given a star, peck will produce food. And if it comes up with no star, peck will not produce food. And here we will eventually get a pigeon pecking the star, provided the background is green. If, however, when it's red, pecks on the star produce no food and pecks on the grid without a star produce food, the pigeon will eventually learn to behave appropriately in the presence of both of these. It will almost always continue to do not quite so well in this one, but it will respond conditionally. What it does with respect to a star in the grid is going to depend upon whether the background is green or red. Let's do one more. I'm going to try to get through this one fairly quickly because it's making the same point. Now we got, again, a pigeon thing, and I promise you we will find that this stuff is going to be relevant to us later on. We've got two keys this time. One of these keys is a schedule key. It's a key on which when the bird pecks might or might not produce food. And these two conditions alternate irregularly, so the pigeon never can tell otherwise whether its peck is occurring during the food availability time, when its pecks will occasionally bring some food up, or it's pecking at a time when pecks are going to do nothing. These two are alternating. But it can go to the second key, and if it pecks that second key, that peck will turn on appropriate colors on the first key. In a way, it can look at what the conditions are on the first key by pecking. We usually look at things by moving around. So I can look at what's over there by turning this way, and I look over there by turning that way. But if we really want to know what the pigeon is attending to, we can get it to peck a key to turn on the stimuli, and then we look at how often it turns them on. And that is a little bit like bringing attention out to a place where we can see it and measure it as it happens. So let's start with the first condition. We start this pigeon out in a case where we're alternating between times when its pecks will produce food, which is when the line is up, and times when its pecks will do nothing, which is when the line is down. You see, and that's all when the key is yellow. So when the key is yellow, it might be reinforcement, it might be extinction. They're irregularly alternating. The pigeon can't tell. And typically what the pigeon will do in this kind of situation is just be pecking all the time. It'll peck throughout this because some of the time its pecks work and some of the time its pecks don't. And there's no way for the pigeon to tell which is which, so it keeps on going. Now we set it up so the pecks on that second key will turn the key colors. If it's a reinforcement time, and the bird pecks that other key, this one comes on green for a little bit. If it's an extinction time and pecks are doing nothing, and it pecks that other key, the key comes on red. Now that's useful for the pigeon to know. And of course, once, assuming we've got a trained pigeon already, when the key comes on green, its pecks produce food, the pigeon pecks a lot. If it pecks that other key and the key comes on red, it just doesn't bother pecking. And it keeps going back and taking a look until eventually this one starts turning on green again and it goes back to work. So this pigeon has the advantage that it can relax and not have to work hard when extinction is there, simply by pecking the other key and looking to see what the condition is right now. Okay? You know when it's going to work, you know when it's not going to work. You can use this other key to find out which condition you're in. So one more procedure though. What effects do these two stimuli have? Can we tease these apart? Supposing we had another procedure in which the only thing that the pigeon can see by looking at it is when it pecks the observing key, if it's the reinforcement condition, the key comes on green. But if it pecks that observing key and its extinction, nothing happens. Instead of seeing red, there's just no change. It just stays yellow. And what we discover is that the pigeon still pecks a lot. It still looks a lot. It pecks the observing key and it still looks a lot to see what color is on. And it learns after a while, the green comes on, you peck a lot here, then you peck and it only comes on yellow. You don't bother pecking the yellow key because after a while you learn that the yellow key is coming on only during extinction. But you peck on the observing key every once in a while until you're getting green again, and the bird looks a lot. One more procedure left. I think you can guess what it's going to be. This one is like the other, except instead of turning on green when reinforcement is going on, The observing pecks only turn on the other key to red when it's extinction. So the bird pecks during the reinforcement thing, nothing happens. The key stays yellow. It pecks during extinction on the observing key, and this key the bird's working on turns red. It keeps on pecking occasionally, and the key comes on red. And when finally it comes on yellow again, then the bird gets back to pecking this key and working on it, and until finally it pecks on the observing key and gets red again. And now, as far as information goes, this information is equally as useful. The bird knows its reinforcement if this comes on green in this condition. In this condition, it knows its reinforcement if it only comes on yellow. Red could tell the bird it's time to stop and take a break. You don't have to respond here because there are no reinforcement. Here's the surprising outcome. The pigeon stops looking. In this condition, where the only thing it sees is whether the key now is not going to be one worth pecking on, it no longer looks. It will look if its pecks produce a stimulus correlated with reinforcement, whether it's in this condition where it turns on either one, or in this condition where it'll only turn on green if it happens to be a reinforcement condition. It stops looking. We do things like that too. We look at the things that pay off. We look at the things that agree with the way we already think about things. We read the newspapers that agree with our current opinions. We tend not to look at things that are correlated with aversive events. We tend not to look at the things that are correlated with non-reinforcement. And this is a problem, because if you ignore the bad news, if you don't look at the, in fact, if there's any mystery, it's why we ever pay attention to the bad news at all. And there may be things to say about that, but that's actually part of a different kind of a talk. Maybe the right experiments haven't been done, but when an observing response produces a stimulus that's correlated with aversive events, but you can do something about those aversive events, then you are more likely to get some observing. But this makes sense of a whole lot of things, like why you may be reluctant to call up the doctor or the medical practice to get the results of that exam that you're waiting for. I mean, could be bad news, right? And who's going to work for bad news? These kinds of things are all around us. So those are some of the basics of this whole business of discrimination. But now let's talk a little bit about extending this to discrimination in the human sense. See, I used to waltz into my undergraduate courses and would say right early on, well, we're going to be talking about this word discrimination. I know it's a sensitive term, and it means different things to different ones of you folks out there, but I want to only talk about it in its technical sense. So forgive me, and then I'd go on and talk about it that way. Well, I was teaching at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. That's UMBC. I don't know. Did you see what we did in the March Madness last season? Anyway, and one of the things about UMBC is the student bodies are pretty representative of the demographics of the surrounding areas in Baltimore and the suburbs in Maryland. And the classes were becoming more and more diverse. And I was finally reaching the point where this just didn't seem to be satisfactory anymore. Another thing about UMBC is that we had acquired somewhere along the line a new president whose name was Freeman Hrabowski. Freeman Hrabowski is African American. The Hrabowski name is both the name of his ancestors and the name of the family that were the owners of his ancestors. So that he has this history of slavery in his ancestry and miscegenation and all of those kinds of things, but a remarkably dynamic guy. He's the kind of a guy who could get in front of an audience of parents and students. The freshman class, he does a convocation every year in which the faculty members sit there and freshman students are coming up, and he gives a speech that the faculty members get up and cheer. I mean, the idea that faculty members would actually cheer a university president who's making a speech, that is weird. And he's also the kind of university president who, if he meets his faculty members walking around campus, will greet them by their first names, knows something about what different faculty members do. So he's done all kinds of things for UMBC. And I had some conversations with him about these sorts of things. And at one point I told him that, yeah, I was concerned about this sort of thing that was going on. And he said, Charlie, you've got to start talking about that in your classes. And so I decided I'd start to do that. And how did I start to do it? Well, you see, if you're talking about discrimination as being responsiveness to different kinds of stimuli, depending upon the consequences of your different responses, then how can you put that in this social sense? Well, I'll start out with one that maybe you're familiar with. If you're a shark and you're walking down the street and there's members of another gang up ahead, or there's members of a gang up ahead, and the other gang might be some other sharks, members of your gang, or they might be jets who are members of a competing gang. You folks get that one, don't you? You know, West Side Story, the sharks and the jets. Okay. If you keep on going and they are members of your own gang, they are other sharks, fine, you're going to horse around, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, it's going to be fun. But if you keep on going and they are members of the rival gang, the jets, and you decide to walk right up to them, there could be consequences there. What happens when you walk up to members of the one gang are going to be different from what happens if you walk up to members of the other gang. So just walking up the street in the presence of these two sets of different discriminative stimuli, that response is going to have different consequences depending upon which one they are. And if there are different consequences, you will discriminate between the members of your gang and the members of the rival gang as surely as the pigeon will discriminate between that green key and the red key. And once you've gotten that far, then you got to start saying to yourself, well, okay, what does this say about what we can say about discrimination? Can we even say anything constructive about it? I mean, this is not just a matter of what happens with gangs. This is and this is all over. It's pervasive in our society, various kinds of discrimination. And we talk about it mainly as a, at least in most circles, a pejorative term. It's not a good thing when it happens, although you do have people who talk about having discriminating tastes and being able to appreciate all kinds of subtle differences. Now, it turns out if you look around at other fields in the social sciences and you look at what the social sciences do, and for example, you look at social psychology, there's a lot about discrimination in social psychology, but none of it is about how discrimination is created. It is mainly about the after effects. So the social psychologist will tell you, well, you put a white guy in front of a screen and you measure the skin resistance on his hand, and you find that you show other white faces to this guy and that nothing spectacular happens, but you put up a black face and this person's skin resistance changes. That's a product of a history. It's a product of behaving in this differential way toward other people, but it doesn't tell you how you got there. We can say, at least with a fair amount of confidence, that a lot of the things that happen when we see this sort of behavior, not all, but a lot, may be because there are differential consequences. If you're a young kid growing up in the inner city and you don't watch out who's on the street and where you go, you can get into real big trouble. And this is one of the places, though, where maybe conditional discrimination would help us, because here's the thing that happens, and I started out very naively with respect to this in talking about the university is a conditional environment, okay? And I could say this about UMBC because of who we have as university president and how things work, the programs that are within it. If you're a student at UMBC, then the things that matter for the people who you're interacting with, whether your fellow students, whether the faculty, whether the administration, are not what the color of your skin is, or what your ethnic designation is, or any of these other, or what your gender is, or any of these other kinds of things. What matters is how well do you do in your courses? What's your work like? Those are the things that matter. it's conditional because if you're a kid who's come from that place, maybe in Baltimore, where there are all kinds of problems, then when you go back into that neighborhood, all those other discriminations have to stay in place. Because there are these different neighborhoods and there are different kinds of things, and this street might be a safer one to walk down than that other one. So universities can be places where there's a conditional environment in which people could learn discriminations that are different from the ones they learned in the environments where they had interactions with people of different sorts. And the discriminations that you learn in one place may be different than the discriminations that you learn in the others. And once you get them started, and now, I mean, I thought a little bit better about this until you had things like well, it turns out that if you're a student at College Park, it's not quite so nice and neat as that, because College Park is historically was historically a white university in the state of Maryland. And so even in recent times, there have been some difficulties there. And then you had the business at Ole Miss and some other places. But still, by and large, it's a better place in terms of people mixing. It made a difference for people to be mixed in various ways. When Harry Truman, at the end of World War II, desegregated the military, yeah, there were lots of problems immediately as people mixed, and some of them continued, but a lot of people got to know other people that they didn't know in other ways. So one of the things that changes this kind of behavior is the fact that different environments. I hope that for everybody here, this is an environment where your concerns about how you do things with kids and all that override any other kinds of dimensions. And by the way, I mainly mentioned race because that happens to be one of the ones that is so prominent, unfortunately, in our culture. But when I started talking about this in my classes, I would ask students about what kinds of discriminations bothered them, and I found it kind of curious because, for example, there would be some of the women in the class who would say, well, I'm discriminated against because I'm tall. So that would be a feature. Or and you go around, there was a guy who was a jock, and he said, well, I'm discriminated against because I'm a jock, and people figure that if you're a jock, you're not particularly a good student, you know. And so you get all of these kinds of things. In fact, I was surprised at how little of what people said in this particular instances were the dimensions that we'd have thought might have been most significant, like ethnic and cultural and racial and so forth. But it got the conversation going, and what would really stop the conversation was when they said, okay, you've been talking about the ways in which you've been treated by other people. Now tell me, when was the last time you behaved that way toward other people? And then the class fell silent because you could tell that there was all kinds of stuff that people now started to reflect upon and that they've... Now, look, we're just scratching the surface on this. Every time I get into this, I can move the envelope a little further. We've got an enormous problem in our culture. I'm talking about a little piece of it, but I hope that the kinds of things we can talk about here are a start for making us see that our science might have something to contribute. Now, I mentioned earlier on that when I was a high school student and it continued during the time I was in college, I worked in Harlem Hospital. And these were in the days, these were in the 50s, the late 50s, a long time ago. You folks, I was a ward attendant some of that time, so there were people going on vacation, and I would spend a week or two on the cancer ward, and a week or two on the surgery ward, and a week or two on this other ward, and then the pneumonia ward, and so forth. And I did have this as a summer job, and I have no doubt that there were some of my coworkers who maybe resented me a little bit because I was the only white kid. Now, by the way, in those days in Harlem Hospital, almost all the staff were African American, although those days African American didn't exist yet. People who had the darker skin were called colored or Negro. Okay, so that was the vocabulary that I grew up with in those settings. But most of them there, if something came up which might be a threat to me, like they wouldn't let me near a guy who was being brought in on a gurney who was in advanced stages of syphilis, and they just wouldn't let me get close. There were all kinds of things that they did to teach me things. And here's one of the things that happened. I began to make discriminations across individuals, because if I talk this way to one of these people and I got this kind of response, and I talked this way to another one of these people and got a different kind of response, I began to learn the differences among them. And there were folks there who worked as hard as anybody I ever saw in my life working. There were the conscientious ones who stayed overtime, who dug in. Then there were the people who were civil servants, and they worked exactly to the job description and not 1 inch further than that. And these were different kinds of people. And once you learn discriminations within a class, that starts to cut across the discriminations that you learn that are across these classes, because these kinds of discriminations about the differences between people with respect to their work ethic and friendliness and all of these kinds of things are the same kinds you make with respect to the people you know from other kinds of groups. And I really look back and think I was incredibly lucky to have learned that real early, and to have discovered that that once you're making these other kinds of discriminations, some of the other ones don't matter anymore. You know the old saying, they all look alike to me. No, there was no way those people were going to look alike to me. No, they were all different. I got to know them, and they taught me a lot. And so I didn't think of it at the time, and I didn't think of it only until recent years, but I think some of that history is what helped to bring me to worry about these sorts of things. Now, there's another problem, though, and that is the things I'm talking about are those things that might result from actual contingencies, the actual interactions you have with other people. And those kinds of things will inevitably create discriminations, but there's this other thing, because in many of the human social situations we worry about, we deal with these things we call prejudices, and prejudices don't necessarily come about through interactions with the other people. They come about through things you've heard about them. And how does that happen? Well, once it's things you've heard about, you've got to realize this is going to be a thing that we can only get to by talking about verbal behavior. I've already mentioned the conditional discriminations, and I have in here again this picture, which was Shimoff and I doing that discrimination reversal. The trouble with starting to talk about prejudice as a separate thing is that we haven't talked much here yet about verbal behavior, and there are things that happen in verbal behavior that are also relevant to what happens with respect to these sorts of issues. Let me ask, is this a good time for a break, do you suppose? A little too soon? Not yet, okay. But now I promised you that there was going to be another topic, and I think it's crucial to spend a little time on this. I want to spend a little time now talking about selection. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to come back to these topics in a little while, but I want to talk about selection a bit. Now, selection. This is B.F. Skinner talking about selection in biology and behavior. This is from his book, Science and Human Behavior. It came out in 1953, and as far as I can tell, it's the very first place where he talked about the parallel between Darwinian selection, the selection that has operated over millennia to change the population of organisms in the world, and operant behavior. In both operant conditioning, Skinner used the word conditioning a lot. I think that word has essentially for us become obsolete, but Skinner said it, so we'll quote it. In both operant conditioning and the evolutionary selection of behavioral characteristics, by that he means selection a la Darwin, consequences alter future probability. Reflexes and other innate patterns of behavior evolve because they increase the chances of survival of the species. Operants grow strong because they are followed by important consequences in the life of the individual. Okay, so Skinner was saying that selective stuff that Darwin worried about in the 19th century is similar to this selective stuff we talk about when we do shaping that we do now we did in the 20th century, we're now doing in the 21st century. I have to keep my centuries straight. They go by too fast. So that's a powerful kind of parallel. There are all kinds of other ways in which the parallels between these kinds of selection can be useful for us to think about what we do. So there's this natural selection a la Darwin. It's still the environment doing the selecting, these evolutionary environments that do the selecting. So you have all these individuals, and some of them make it and reproduce, and others don't. And so therefore you have the selection of populations. All of the selection is based on their behavior. Behavior is at the heart of all of this. Organisms survive only based on what they can do, and all of the things about their physiology, their skeletal systems, their muscles, the heart, the brain, all of those things are in the service of behavior. Only if they can find mates, eat, drink, avoid predators, only if they can engage in those important kinds of behavior do they survive. And the behavior then is the basis on which this other stuff that allows it to happen survives. So behavior, that's one of the reasons. For us, behavior is always where we start. You start with behavior, the other stuff follows from it. And it's the environment that does it. That environment also includes other members of your own species, of course. And then there's this other kind of selection we'll call ontogenic, or operant selection. We do lots of different things. Some of the things we do have consequences, and the things that have certain consequences we continue doing, and other things we stop doing. And some of our behavior survives, and some of our behavior falls by the wayside. Isn't it curious? Some of the behavior extinguishes. That's the same as the evolutionary word, and yet it turns out those two words came from totally different places in the history of our respective sciences. In biology, they came from a different place than they came in psychology. But nevertheless, the same words are appropriate. In Darwin's day, people challenged Darwin because he was suggesting that natural selection worked. But you know, the curious thing was that in Darwin's day, everybody, at least in European culture or certainly in British culture at the time, knew about artificial selection. They knew that farmers could breed cows for more yield of milk, and they knew that people involved in horticulture could breed plants for having all these properties, or plants that were resistant to disease and all of these kinds of things. So everybody took artificial selection for granted. What was controversial was the notion that natural contingencies could do the same thing. And so Darwin started already knowing about artificial selection. He didn't invent that. It was there already. And artificial in those days meant something really different than it means to us. Artificial was not something that was sort of fake. It's not corresponding to the real thing. Artificial was something created artfully. It was artificially made with this art, and farmers who knew how to do this selective breeding, or pet owners who bred dogs and cats to have certain characteristics. They did their work artfully. They got better and better at it. And then came the natural stuff. Well, even the most adamant cognitive psychologists who will put down behavior analysis will acknowledge that we can train animals to do tricks. Maybe we can even train the occasional nonverbal child to do certain kinds of things. But their argument is that none of this stuff happens naturally. Well, we got a message to deliver there, because the more and more we know about early child development, the more it seems that a lot of the early linguists who said that we couldn't talk about novel sentences and all those kinds of things, and who put our field down for that reason, we now have a whole set of things that we know about involving creation of new behavior and shaping, and a couple of other things we'll talk about later, that give us the sources of this new behavior. And we are getting to be in a better and better position to show that natural contingencies do work and do make a difference. So in all of these cases, we're talking about how the behavior of the individual organism is changed by the consequences of its behavior within its own lifetime. And then there's another level. And I've got here cultural or mimetic. I'm trying out the word sociogenic as being for this other level. Behavior survives not only in the lifetime of the individual, but it gets from one individual to another. This biologist named Dawkins talked about memes, which now memes, that word itself has become a meme because you find it popping up all over the place. The trouble with that, it was things like catchy tunes, and it wasn't really important functional behavior, but we pass a lot of behavior on from one individual to another. One very neat little bit of behavior that we pass on is if you're raised in an environment in which people are speaking in a particular language like English, then by the time kids get to a certain age, if they're going through the normal developmental routine, they are going to be speaking in the same phonemes as the language that they're hearing around them. And if they're raised in an Arabic household, then the kid will not hear a difference between P and B because there's one single consonant that's somewhere in between. But if the kid's raised in an English-speaking household, that kid will hear the difference between a P and a B because that difference is important in the English vocabulary. Those phonemes are different classes of behavior that are being passed along from one generation to the next, from one person to the next. And those are bits of behavior that also get selected by verbal environments. So the selection at this level, as behavior is passed on from one individual to another, are essential. You can't have language without that. You can't have a single individual alone in a language. Language is about interactions between individuals. And we need this third level of selection to talk about that level. So it's selection of behavior as it is passed on from one individual to another. And you know, I meant, what about memes? Okay. Dawkins introduced the meme as a unit passed on from some individuals to others, catchy melodies, ideas. We ought to be thinking about this as behavior, bits of behavior. Dawkins also spent a lot of time worrying about how they were transmitted, but didn't talk about how they might evolve. If we start looking at behavior this way, we can see lots of examples. And by the way, it's not just verbal stuff. Ethnic ways of cooking can be passed on from some individuals. And you don't have to be related to somebody who's Italian to learn how to make pizza. You don't have to be related to somebody who's Szechuan to be able to make certain kinds of Chinese food. These kinds of practices are passed on across individuals independently of other kinds of relatedness. Okay? And at each of these levels, behavior comes first. Anatomies are selected because they serve behavior. There are constraints. Yeah, you got to have the right kinds of anatomies. We're never going to evolve a third eye in the middle of our heads because evolutionary systems don't tend to duplicate something that are already there and working pretty well, and don't expect any special limbs to come out of our shoulder blades. So we're not going to grow wings. Although, remember, as Pat Fryman reminded us, you can all regard yourselves as angels, right? You did get that line, right? I hope some of you were there. I thought that was a pretty good line. In fact, structure matters. In fact, if you think of structure and function, in physiology and anatomy, you have the concern of biologists with how organs function, that's the physiology, or how they're put together, that's the anatomy. We, in the analysis of behavior, usually worry a lot more about how the behavior functions. What does it do? There are many areas of psychology in which the main concern is what is the structure of this behavior, and that's fine. It's sometimes useful to know about structure. But if you're not concerned with what it's doing, you may be missing the point for doing something with this stuff. I would always want to make the argument that we ought to, our field specifically wants to concentrate on the physiology or on the functions of the behavior that we study. So as I say, you're in analyses of verbal behavior, linguists have stressed structure, behavior analysts have looked at function. By the way, these different kinds of selection don't have to work together. Okay? some examples. Drug addiction. All these problems with the opioids these days. People take the opioids, and lots of people take it to the point that tens of thousands of deaths per year now with people on OxyContin and all of these other opioids. They've gotten addicted to it. That is behavior that is reinforced. It is selected by the consequences of taking this particular kind of drug. But if you're doing that, you're certainly, some drugs will damage the developing fetus. They're going to have all kinds of consequences. If you're a young person and you get addicted and you end up overdosing and dying, you're not going to contribute to the gene pool. So the phylogeny and the ontogeny there are working against each other, not with each other. You can have medicine being a social practice of enhancing the survival, and therefore, people now are living longer. Survival of infants is better than it's been, although not as good in our country as in many other countries, unfortunately, and that's a tragedy. We should be able to do better. But then you've got these things that spread around in which people want to argue against immunization. Well, there's a case in which the social practice of all these folks talking about all this stuff about how bad immunization can be, leading to the recurrence of diseases that should have been out of the picture years ago. So kids, suddenly there are epidemics of diseases that should have been gone. Measles coming back, polio coming back. There's no reason these things have to work together at the level of phylogeny and sociogeny, well, you can do all of the different you have sociogenic contributions. So if you can have behavior that might be maintained by natural contingencies, but then if you have, for example, a practice of celibacy, there's a case in which the individuals who begin to practice celibacy will not be contributing to the gene pool. Well, there are some religions that talk it but don't do it as well, but let's not get into that. That's too political. So selection at any level can have multiple consequences. It can the sexual selection, by the way, the giraffe the long neck may not have been selected for getting fruit on tall trees. It's more likely that female giraffes have developed preference for male giraffes with longer necks. If it was only a matter of getting the fruit on the tall trees, then the female giraffe's neck should have been growing as much as the male. Why should they be at a disadvantage? And the guys get the fruit on the high trees and they never get any, right? That doesn't seem fair. But if the females prefer males with longer necks, that by itself will drive the selection so that the males with longer necks will be more likely to contribute to the gene pool. And there's a fair amount of evidence developing there. The trouble with that is, though, we now know a bit more in biology, and it may turn out that kind of selection can also lead to some dead ends in which creatures that have those kinds of preferences may be more subject to the kinds of challenges that we have to threaten species than ones that are much more generalists. Well, anyway, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. So there's a parallel between short and long-term contingencies for giraffes and peacocks at the phylogenetic level, and between cases of the short-term contingencies and the long-term contingencies that we talk about when we talk about self-control. Analogies all over the place. Selection is at the heart of what we do. Child-rearing practices are passed on. Some of those going to survive better than others. Punishment. Pat Fryman in his address today talked about this passing on of the practice of blame and punishment. Well, this is a kind of a thing. If you're there and a child is doing something and you want to strengthen that and you reinforce it, if it's something like the child doing homework or spending a little time doing some academic thing, you might not see a result of that right away. Immediately after delivering that reinforcer, nothing immediately happens. If the kid's doing something you don't like, though, and you swat the kid, you're going to have an immediate effect. The kid's going to stop doing it. It's a thing that has very immediate consequences instead of delayed consequences. Well, let me tell you, even if one of these is a lot better in the long run, the one that has immediate consequences is a lot easier to pass on to other people in the culture than the one that has consequences that show up after a little while. So punishment has a big edge over reinforcement if you're going to be trying to teach it. And the kind of problem that Pat was talking about this morning is one that's a product of that. Yeah, it's harder for us. Shaping is not, some people fortunately do sort of pick it up, and some people, even without having been formally taught about it, will do that. Some parents learn that that's the way things go. But by and large, we have to spend a lot of time getting it out there into our culture. And if the other aversive stuff is much more easily transmitted, we're working against a big disadvantage. So thinking about these different levels of selection is really important. In part of all this, then, we have the message that if we come up with anything to say that's relevant about things like discrimination and prejudice and those kinds of things, we've got to work damned hard to get it out there, because we've got an existing set of practices against which there's a lot of resistance. So I'm going to skip on quickly past these are in the stuff you can download. I'll just a couple of more points that variation, you can't have selection unless you have variations. You've got to have variable kinds of behavior. You can also select for variations. It turns out that a colleague named Alan Nuringer has been doing these beautiful experiments showing that if what you reinforce now is a response different from what you saw the last time, and you keep on doing that, you get an organism that responds with more and more variations. Beautiful kind of finding, because as we will see later, variations at every level, whether you're talking phylogeny, ontogeny, sociogeny, variation at every level is important. And in fact, what I will be doing by the time we wrap up is be closing with a plea for the incredible importance for our culture and for our science of diversity. It's not a thing that is nice to have. It's a thing that's essential. We can't live without it. And any kind of culture that suppresses diversity, whether with respect to immigration or with respect to the differential treatment of people within our culture, is doing incredible damage. And we have to do everything we can to strengthen diversity, because it's this, those variations are the source of everything that we can work on and all of the kinds of things that we can do. So we can create novel behavior through shaping. We can have, we'll talk a little bit about higher order classes and equivalence classes. We have things we can teach kids using discrimination, like joint control, which is getting kids to attend to things and looking at where the teacher is looking or looking at where the parent is looking. We can look at the correspondences between our behavior. We have a whole slew of, and we can directly reinforce novelty. How does selection create classes? Well, I'm going to stop there. Now are we good? Our timing good? Let's take a break. What, 10 minutes or 15-minute break? So I have 2:20, which means we will start promptly at 2:35. Okay? We'll start without you if you're late. I promise. I've got to remind you that all of this stuff started with this guy who's got this little box with a lever in it, and he's playing with rats and looking at how often the rat presses the lever. And here we are talking about this huge stuff involving human culture and all that. And so how do we get there from something as simple as that? He had the spark, this guy Skinner, of looking at this. And when he was looking at this, these rats were doing things, and there weren't even good words for describing what was going on. So part of his innovation was to find the words to describe what was going on in this little chamber in a way that generalized all of these other kinds of things. I mean, how could he have anticipated things like later talking about higher order classes? So one of the things about the lever press was he defined it in terms not of what the lever press looked like. He couldn't care less whether the rat pressed with the right paw or the left paw, both paws together, sat on the lever, bit the lever, any of those kinds of things. As long as that lever moved, that made it count as a lever press. The form did not matter. It was what the lever press did. And he came up with this word because at that time he was captured by the language of Pavlov. And it wasn't working for him, and he knew it had to change. And he came up with this word operant. He stuck with the word conditioning for a while. That still is a word you'll hear, but as far as I'm concerned, try to eradicate it. It was a bad translation in the first place. Pavlov's conditioned reflexes were supposed to have been translated as conditional reflexes. They were conditional upon setting up this relation between the tone and the food. And it became conditioned, and then are you conditioning me is what somebody will say to somebody else. It's not really a functional word. It doesn't work for us. And when people do apply it to the things that we do, it just brings back all of that stuff that we're mainly interested in, controlling the behavior of other people and doing that villainous stuff that we also get a bad reputation for. In a higher order class, you'd have, for example, a kid on a unit who is engaging in self-injurious behavior. And you might do a functional analysis and find out that that for this particular kid, the kid gets some attention when the kid engages in this kind of behavior. You might find out from another kid that if you're placing any demands, like trying to get this kid to do some academics things, that's when this kid starts engaging in the self-injurious stuff. So it has different functions for different kids. And then you find that the psychiatrists put into their diagnostic manuals self-injurious behavior as a category. And all of those categories are structural categories. They're based on form, not on function. They wouldn't distinguish between the two kids, one of whom gets out of demands and the other of whom gets attention. But it could be worse than that, because supposing you want to get rid of that behavior and you try getting rid of attention following upon the self-injurious behavior, and you find it doesn't go away. Maybe the problem is not that the differential contingencies don't work, but that this is just one of a whole population of different things that this kid does that are all attention-getting. So you could start shouting obscenities, you could start picking on other kids, you could start self-injurious behavior, you could start breaking stuff. All of these kinds of things are ways to get attention, and they become this massive class because of a history that the kids had, and you want to get just this little bit. You want to get rid of just this one little piece of it, but all the others are still being reinforced. If you don't know what the functional class is, including the bigger classes within which it may be nested, you can run into problems. So just because you picked out this one because it has a particular look to it, you may be, one of the questions to ask yourself if your things aren't going well is, have I really got the class characterized properly? Have I got the function down? And one way to figure out the function is look at the reinforcers and then to say, once you know what's reinforcing this one, what other things does that reinforcer work on at the same time? That can give you clues for the higher order classes. And then there are stimulus classes and reinforcer classes. You know that if you're having a difficult time teaching a discrimination, if what holds those classes together, what holds Skinner's operant lever press together, the rat's lever presses, is not the form, it's because they all have the common consequence, they all produce the same reinforcer. Well, if producing the same reinforcer is what creates an operant class, then whenever we're trying to teach a discrimination, we've got the responses to these two different stimuli. If it's you respond one way and produce the reinforcer, if this stimulus is there, you respond another way and produce the reinforcer if the other stimulus is there. Mainly we've been using the examples of go on green and stop on red, but lots of discriminations are you do different things in the presence of each stimulus. So if the pigeon pecks the left key and that produces food according to one schedule, and it pecks the right key, and that produces food according to another schedule. If it's the same food, you're trying to make these two different responses turn out differently, even though they're producing the same reinforcer. Well, that same reinforcer, when it was pressing with the left paw and pressing with the right paw, created the operant class called lever pressing. And people have discovered, for example, that if you're having trouble teaching kids to learn matching to sample, and so there you've got the thing where one stimulus comes up and they're supposed to press here, and the other stimulus comes up, and you use the same reinforcer no matter what the sample was and what the comparison stimulus was, you can have a lot of trouble. But if given sample A, you make response, you pick comparison A, and then you get reinforcer A, and given sample B, you make response B, and then you get reinforcer B, so that they produce different reinforcers. Things that were hard to teach suddenly become easy to teach. Look at whether you're using the same reinforcer across different classes of stimuli when you want to teach new discriminations. Plug in different reinforcers for each one, and you may find you simplify. If you're going to go away with one bit of practical advice, at least I've done that little bit, okay? I hope it's so. So classes, I mean, it's if we're going to select behavior, we can shape it. We create these classes through shaping. When we do that, we've got to worry about not the form or the topography. We've got to look at the function. Yeah, we started out talking about actually we talked recently about lever presses and key pecks, but remember I talked a lot about attention. Classes of behavior also are not defined as movement. Hey, yeah, we study things like the rat pressing the lever, the pigeon pecking the key, but shifts of attention, yeah, we created some ways in which we could look at attention by saying that the pigeon's peck on that observing key was an attending response. But if you're listening to music, you're listening to I tend to listen to classical stuff. You probably have other tastes, but that's okay, that's good. But if you're listening to the middle voice and you want to shift to the bass player, or if you're listening to the singer in a group and then you want to listen to the person who's playing the guitar or whatever, you don't have to move your head to listen to one to another. You're doing something, but it's not defined by movement. It's defined by the differential responsiveness to whatever's happening out there in the world. It's, in fact, more obvious in the case of music that you don't have to do something specific to listen differentially to different pieces, different voices. You could have listened separately to the bass line of the young man who played the piano this morning. And you could then listen and pay attention to what he was playing with the other hand and so forth. And you could shift your attention. Well, if behavior is not defined by movement, how do you do it? It's simple. We call it behavior if it's something that is sensitive to its consequences. If we have some way of telling when it's happening, and then we can arrange different consequences depending upon when it's happening, and then we can change its likelihood, then it's behavior. We know we can arrange contingencies for shifts of attention. We don't have to count them as movements. We have various kinds of ways of telling whether that's happening. And given the differential contingencies, sometimes it pays to pay attention carefully. Sometimes you can doze off. You can doze off during part of my talk. I'm repetitive enough that maybe you won't miss too much, but that's okay. There may be differential consequences on when you should pay attention and when not. It's not movement that matters. It's whether your attention changes as a function of what's going on. So these are, I mean, there's all kinds of, we talked about self-injurious behavior and attention getting. We've talked about higher order classes a little bit. Higher order classes is when you have a big class, like kids can do lots of different imitations, but each specific one is a subclass in there. And then it starts to get interesting, because what if you have the child seeing the model doing something totally new? If the child then responds appropriately to that, you know you've got a higher order class, which is defined not by the particular characteristics of this instance, but is defined by the correspondence between what the model did and with what the kid did. And once you've got that going, and you can create new behavior by modeling something new, you've got the opportunity for extending things. Another kind of generalized class is the one that's involved in verbal behavior, which we call instruction following. People, I guess the most obvious example is in the military. If you're in the military, each order is specific. There's a specific thing said to you and a specific thing you end up doing. And those are all separate classes. But following orders is a higher order class. And you can be given an order that you never heard before, and as long as it's spoken in words that you're in your history, the words that you understand, you're expected to do it. Now, if you're then in the military and you're now put in a place where you got pitted against the social contingencies that created the following of orders, the military spends a lot of time with all kinds of social contingencies, making sure all of the lower ranks obey the orders of the people in the next higher rank, and no exceptions. But then you go into battle and you got pitted the social consequences of following the order versus the natural consequences doing something like going to a place where you're putting your life on the line. The higher order consequences may be different from the consequences for the specific instances, and that's where lots of the tension is. And we will be talking a little bit when we get further on, not too much, but a little bit. This business of higher order classes will enter into some of the kinds of things we'll be moving on to. I won't say more about matching to sample, except to say that there are these cases in which you can teach people the relationships between different terms, and so you can get people to match one set of stimuli to a particular set of comparison stimuli, and then you can get those new comparisons to be the samples to learn still another set. And the thing about that is once you've learned A to B and you learn B to C, you don't have to separately teach A to C. So you've got these other kinds of relations that emerge, and when you do enough of that, you create new stimulus classes that we call equivalence classes. Equivalence classes are one subclass of a larger set of things that Skinner in the book Verbal Behavior originally called frames. You may have heard the words frames coming up in other places. Steve Hayes has gotten a lot of mileage out of the language of frames. It's all in verbal behavior in Skinner's book. But they are other kinds of classes, like the class opposite and some of these kinds of things. The thing about all of that is once you're looking at those kinds of frames, they are higher order classes too, and they break down into the specific sets of stimuli plus the relationships that make up the frames. And one of the things that behavior analysis will do that you don't find in relational frame theory is a discussion of what happens when the contingencies for the specific members get pitted against the overall class. And I will have an example for you about that in a little while. So now let's get back to discrimination as it appears in our colloquial vocabulary. Okay? And some of the topics I hope I will get to, but let me run through them quickly just in case we do. There's the language of discrimination. We've already talked about that. It's a funny kind of language. We do the discriminating. Okay? It's not the response. You know, we go through all this stuff of saying if you're going to do shaping, you're going to talk about reinforcement, you should talk about reinforcing the response. Don't talk about reinforcing the person. That's just too ambiguous. Reinforce the response, not the organism. But when we start talking about discriminative stimuli, we say that the person discriminates. But in fact, you could have one response that is controlled by one dimension of, you see, that's that word controlled, that is controlled by one dimension of the stimulus, and a different one that's controlled by another dimension of the stimulus. Say one response that depends on the color of a light, and the other depends on its shape. And it's really each response discriminates something different. Wouldn't it be great if we could switch our whole language and break it loose from the everyday language of discrimination by talking about the responses doing the discriminating rather than the organisms? We can't legislate that. The field is too entrenched. The vocabulary is around. It's been around too long. But once you start thinking about it that way, you start seeing different pieces of the way that stuff works. So another thing that happens once we get into verbal stuff, and remember, I'm now segueing from the kinds of things we talked about with respect to discriminations into talking about the way language works, because I want to get to talking a bit about prejudice. One of the things that happens over and over and over again when you look at human behavior with respect to this stuff we call discrimination is you take continua. You take things that change gradually as you follow along a dimension, and they're turned into dichotomies, sometimes into trichotomies, sometimes more than that. Classic one in the history of racial stuff in the United States. Okay? Yes, there are some intermediate classes like mulattoes, but by and large, in the United States, it was enough. The idea was one drop of black blood and you were black. And as Malcolm X said, boy, if it only took one drop, that must have been mighty powerful blood. And so we take, but you know, the fact of the matter is that in the United States over time, over a long history, and genetics is showing it more and more, there's been miscegenation, there's been intermarriage at all sorts of levels. I live in the town of Columbia, which is also an integrated community, and you go to the Columbia Mall, which is still around, I mean, you see lots of interracial couples, okay, and I know a fair number of them. And so once you're starting looking at that, you can't divvy this sort of thing up. There's a whole continuum, and yet we live in a culture which still insists that you got to break it up and you use this word for those folks and use this other word for the other folks. When the continuum is what matters, it's not just skin color, okay? It happens with respect to other kinds of groupings. So, for example, there's a woman named Draeger who's written a book called Galileo's Middle Finger. It turns out to be about research into how the research literature in obstetrics and gynecology has distorted over the years the research into what happens when children are born with ambiguous genitalia. Okay? It turns out that for decades, many OB/GYN doctors, when a child was born with ambiguous genitalia, would resolve the ambiguity surgically without even telling the parents. And so you'd have kids who were born somewhere on the continuum between male and female. You know, you go from male to female, and hermaphrodites, classically in the ancient world, were in the middle. And then you have people trying to impose the gender dichotomy upon them. Well, if you start looking into what that history means, you've got a spectrum of people who are hormonally different along a continuum, ranging from the one end with estrogen and the other end with testosterone, who are anatomically spread out along a continuum, and most likely who are also, with respect to things about the nervous system, spread out along a continuum. Well, if you start looking at these continua, you've got this whole space in which any particular person you meet will belong somewhere in this space. But it's all a continuous space. It's the whole range of human variation. But what do? We cut it up. There are the gays and the lesbians and the transgender folks and the queers and we slice it up because we've got words that tend to be mapped onto continua. I was thinking for a while that that was oh yeah, okay. Actually, I put some of this into a later. I'm jumping ahead because I want to get all this stuff in. If you start thinking about ethnic stuff, you can say, "Oh, that's not true of ethnic stuff. You're either Catholic or Protestant." Now, wait a minute. Or you're either Hispanic, or you're, Italian, or you're this, or you're that. You're Irish, or whatever. But it turns out that what kind of a category is Hispanic? Are you a Hispanic with ancestry from Cuba, or from Puerto Rico, or from Mexico? Where are the lines? Start looking at cultural practices, and you've got all kinds of continua there. Everywhere you look, you find that our verbal practices take differences that are part of the continuously varying range of human possibilities, and breaks it up into categories, and pretty soon once you've got the categories, people start being pitted against each other along these kinds of dimensions. It's a kind of thing that we folks can deal with. The culture doesn't have good ways of talking about it. It's something where we're just beginning to scratch the surface as we learn more and more about how verbal behavior works. It's one of those kinds of things. Now, I'm going to come back. I've got here the topic of talking about causes versus talk about thresholds. I have a specific example of that, but it comes up a little later, so I'm going to save that. I'm also going to come up with something on equivalence classes and on contingency-shaped stuff. And but I wanted to present this list first and then say, now, okay, what do we have? What can we do with this stuff? So what I want to emphasize, and the things I'm going to cover as we move on from here, is some of the problems that face us. I don't have I absolutely am sure that that we don't have solutions yet, but at least we're in a position of at least being able to characterize the problems in behavioral terms. If we can do that, we're maybe in a position to help create some solutions. What are the tools we have? Well, I've already been talking about the continua. Human features such as skin color typically vary along continua, and prejudices usually reduce individuals to membership in a small number of classes characterized by sharp divisions. You belong to one or you belong to the other. Examples are race, gender. I've already mentioned the racial issues, the gender issues with respect to the transgender and the other kinds of designations. Classes, you know, you're either in the middle class or in the upper class. That's another set of continua, which certainly vary along the dimension of what the economic resources people have to work with. But we begin to talk about people in terms of classes. And I've mentioned the ethnic classes. Well, yes, in the ethnic areas, there are some differences that have to do with specific practices, depending, for example, what religion you practice and so forth, which may create some hard divisions. So I'm not saying this is a universal kind of thing, but it's certainly something to look at whenever you're facing these issues. Now I want to move on to an example of equivalence classes, about which we are also beginning to learn more and more. This is one that was done in Northern Ireland by Mickey Keenan and some of his students. In Northern Ireland, you got both the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish, okay, or the Catholic Nationalists and the Protestant Unionists, if you want to be more specific. And Mickey was studying some of these kinds of things, and this is important, I think, because it's an example of how the different levels of contingencies can lead to different kinds of outcomes. If you're pitting a general set of relationships against specific ones. So in these two classes are really pretty well-defined classes in Northern Ireland. Now let's suppose you have two sets of stimuli that you want to try to create in the lab as an experiment. And the subjects you're going to be bringing in are some people who growing up in the Catholic Nationalist neighborhood, and some others who are growing up in the Protestant Unionist neighborhood. And some places, in a lot of places in Ireland, these are still pretty well demarcated neighborhoods. So you have one set of stimuli, A1, B1, C1, and another set of stimuli, A2, B2, C2. Now the middle term B in that set of relationship is a node. It's the one that connects the A term to the C term, okay? So what Mickey did in this experiment was he had a common node for each of these classes, but the A term for A1 was a common Catholic Nationalist term, and the B term was the Protestant Unionist term. So, for example, it might be the color green if you're Catholic, or the orangeman's color orange if you're Protestant. Or it might be a name. I'm reacting a little, like Patrick, you're probably Catholic Irish, but George, you're probably Protestant Irish. And so what he found was that if the node connected two terms from the different groups, it was much, much harder for people to learn these equivalences than if the node connected two terms from within the same class. okay? So this is telling you something about what's already built in to the thing. It is much more difficult to create new classes 1 and 2 if the nodes connect the nationalist and unionist symbols than if they connect symbols within a single class. Now, I don't know what the answer is to that, but hey, we've spent so much time and effort learning how to create equivalence classes. You go to the literature, both in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior and all kinds of other journals, including our European ones and so forth, and a lot of people are learning how to put together equivalence classes. What we need to learn about is how you can take existing equivalence classes and take them apart. We've got to learn what the ways are to disconnect the classes so as to be able to create new ones. Maybe things that cut across classes would help. By the way, one hopeful thing was that Mickey found that if you worked with students who were taking courses at the universities like in Belfast, where you had students from both sources and both kinds of neighborhoods mixing, these effects were much weaker than if you're working with high school kids who are coming from neighborhoods in which there was much less mixing, which means that the environments in which you interact with the others can make a difference. But one of the things then is to know that even with something as seemingly esoteric as the equivalence class experiments, you can be tapping into questions about assessing these kinds of things in different kinds of environments. You can at least measure them, determine where the prejudices are. Whether you're concerned with the differences that exist among, say, Chinese and Japanese and Koreans, or whether you're interested in the differences among people from various African countries and origins. There's discriminations within and across classes of these kinds of labeling. As soon as you get nationalistic labeling, it gets complicated. So this is one place in which we have potential tools. So most research on equivalence classes has been about ways to build them. We need to know about how to take them apart. We also need to know about the respondent processes. Fortunately, living in Columbia, I've had a variety of friends of different backgrounds, and I swim 2 or 3 times a week. Actually, not during the summer because the pool is closed down for renovations. And was talking with one African-American friend of mine, and we were talking about the Confederate flag at the time when that was a bigger issue, a little back again. And at one point in the conversation, she says, "Wait a minute, Charlie, you got to understand, this isn't a rational thing. This is visceral." Okay, and yes, obviously, that I haven't talked about the kinds of things that Michael Dyson talks about in the book Tears We Cannot Stop, or Ta-Nehisi Coates speaks about in his book Between the World and Me, and so forth. There are components of this that tack into the kinds of respondent relations. And it was after that conversation I've often gone down to Charlottesville to attend something there that's an annual thing. And it was only after that conversation with him that it suddenly hit me what it must be like to drive through Charlottesville, through Virginia. And hey, it's not so far from Washington, D.C. and where I live in Maryland. And you get this new shopping center, which is called Stonewall Mall. And then you're driving on Lee Highway, and you've got all of this stuff. These things are still around, and I don't have to, you folks, especially those of you who are close to, know what this is like. We're just scratching the surface here. And there are people who we're not going to reach so easily with what we do. As far as they're concerned, diversity is a terrible thing. And the United States is going downhill for allowing it. We know enough to know better. And we've got to marshal whatever we can to push back against those kinds of things and use whatever tools we have. But we have to worry about the respondent ends of things too. And those work through the creation of equivalence classes and so on. We need to know about more effective ways to break those classes down. I mentioned earlier on that one of the things I learned when I was working in Harlem Hospital was discriminations across the members of the people I was working with. You know, they were all different folks. As I said at that time, There were some, actually, I think a relatively small number who resented my being there. But once I was learning things about them, which were just like the things I knew about people who were from the other environments in which I lived, and I mentioned that I lived in a multi-ethnic neighborhood. On my street were Jews and Irish and Italians and Greeks and Hispanics and Scandinavians, all within one block. In fact, 5 of those 6, the Scandinavian guy was 2 buildings over. But the rest of them were all in my building. These were walk-up apartments. This is way before, you focus on before air conditioning, kinds of things like. We all got along. And by the way, and my mother, my mother eventually ended up living by herself in an apartment building on Main Street in Flushing in Queens, New York. And when we used to visit her, we used to call it the United Nations, because if you got in the elevator, you'd encounter people from 3 or 4 different continents. Okay, there'd be a woman from India who was dressed in the standard Indian dress, and there'd be not an African American, but an African, somebody who had just come over from Nigeria, and so they all got along. And in fact, there's this marvelous book called Pax Ethnica, which identifies places in the world where people get along, and unfortunately, some of those get torn apart. Aleppo was a place like that, but that's been torn apart by what's been going on in Syria. But many of these places exist, and one of the chapters in this book, Pax Ethnica, used Flushing in Queens, where my mother lived, as an example. And I think the characteristic of it was there were so many minorities there that no one had control over the group as a whole, and therefore the only way to negotiate all this was for everybody to get along, and they would always be helping each other out without regard to all of these other kinds of irrelevant differences. So there's hope for the world. We are the carriers of some of the messages to make things better, and we're going through bad times right now. And I promised that I wouldn't get into politics, and I won't. But we've got the tools, and we want to keep using them to address these kinds of issues. So perhaps by creating incompatible classes, by teaching new discriminations among the members within a class, so that they no longer all look the same to me, that can make a difference. We've got to teach that kind of stuff. And of course, it's the kind of thing we also worry about with respect to the classroom. When kids come into a classroom and the teachers are already ready to treat them differently, because these kids have this kind of look, and therefore they can't possibly be expected to be up to the snuff for these other kids. I mean, there's a lot of that implicit stuff still exists in educational systems. Those of us who are learning about teaching through behavior analysis have to push back against that wherever we find it. And by the way, our prejudices aren't just about people. There are all kinds of prejudices about things. This is a thing I did a while ago. It's cumulative gun deaths. The data are all based on a set of data from Mother Jones magazine, which follows these kinds of things. You can go online and you can get the latest updating. If I had updated this to include the Las Vegas shooting plus a couple of the recent things, it's the scariest data I've ever plotted. And by the way, my one big TV moment was Rachel Maddow once quoted me on this and said, "These were the scariest data ever." He said these were the scariest data. The line is, if you add the Las Vegas shooting and some other stuff, it's getting close to vertical. Now, if you ask about guns, you get a lot of people have not had experience with guns. I haven't had much experience with guns, but that's because when my mother was a preteen, she was escorting her younger brother and younger sister to the movies. We're talking about let's see, this would have been the 1910s, though, somewhere around that. And her younger brother went to a lot with another friend of his, another kid, and they found a gun that was there, and the friend picked up the gun, and it ended up going off, and the bullet went through the friend's finger and hit this guy, who would have been my uncle, in the belly, and he died of the wound. And my mother was, for the rest of her life, always thought it was her fault because she was the one who was escorting the kids there. So my mother, can you imagine during World War II not letting your kid play with guns? I mean, play war games, things like that. So we didn't have guns around the house. But so this was not an arbitrary, this was not a prejudice in the sense that she learned about problems with guns. She learned it the hard way, and was involved with that. In those days, they used to lay the body up at home in the apartment where they lived. And so this, who would have been my Uncle Paul, my mother had a big family. They were 12 kids. I mean, it was of which 3 of them grew up to be, 3 of them didn't live much past very early. In fact, I think a couple were probably miscarriages. But anyway, but lots of people, what they know about guns is mainly the things that they appeal to when they start talking about constitutional things and rights and all of this kind of stuff. And it goes through all of these arguments. But so, hey, you know, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Is this a prejudice? Is this something somebody learned? Yes, there are people who've seen what guns do because they've served in the military, but there's a whole, well, let's look at it in a different way. The political talk about gun deaths is about causes. What are the real causes? Well, maybe it's mental illness. Well, maybe it's the media. Well, maybe it's playing violent video games or computer games. But let's look at it in the way we ought to look at it, because this is, again, a signal detection thing, and it's a stimulus control thing. And let's imagine that we have a whole population of people who, did I accidentally? I lost the graph. Okay. We're not going to do a lot of this verbal behavior stuff anyway, but I don't know how that skipped so far back. This is all the stuff that you get a good glimpse now, because we're not going to get through the rest of this stuff. There we are. Oh, wait a minute, that's still not it. I must have leaned on something when I turned around. Yeah, here we go. Okay, that's the one I want. Okay, imagine you've got a population of individuals, and they all vary in the likelihood that given a gun, they'll do something nasty with it, okay? The likelihood that they'll go somewhere and fire it off. So ordinarily, if no guns existed whatsoever, the threshold for this happening is going to be so far above this that nobody's behavior is going to go above that threshold. But let's suppose guns are available and everything else is roughly constant, then there's going to be some threshold value, and there's going to be all these fluctuations in the population. Every once in a while, just by chance, somebody's behavior is going to pop off above the threshold. So in this particular case, at this threshold, there'll be one shooting incident. But let's suppose there's a whole bunch of media coverage, and let's suppose that just a lot of talk about shootings raises the likelihood that somebody will do a copycat thing. Okay? So what that does is lower the threshold a little bit, because it's, and now instead of just one incident, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? Now let's suppose that all of this was in the time of year when the weather's pretty good and all, and now you're in the middle of a summer, you have power outages, you've got people who are hot and uncomfortable, they're getting out of their place, there are more people on the street, more likelihood of fights and so forth, and the threshold goes down a little bit lower. And now you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 incidents. Or did I miss one? Did I miscount? Well, you got a lot, 8, okay? Was the change in the weather the cause of the shootings? Not by itself. Was the media coverage the cause of the shootings? Not by itself. Was the availability of guns the cause? Not by itself. But they all contributed. The language of causes is another one of those prejudicial languages that sets us up to debate these things in a totally inappropriate way. The language of thresholds should tell us that anything we could do to change any one of these thresholds is going to save lives. Any one of them. And the trouble is, once you have a multiply determined thing of that sort, to pull that out statistically so that you can demonstrate that there's a statistical significance and this really is a thing, becomes really a problem if you've got 18 different variables. And so nobody does anything about it. The obvious stuff, if you don't have the stocks, that's going to change things a little bit because it's going to change some thresholds. One of the big things we could do is to start taxing the ammunition. There's a whole bunch of things. Well, let's not go into the politics of that. If you want to get into that, that becomes another kind of thing. But one of the things we can contribute to the talk and the culture is if you ever have to write an op-ed piece about this stuff and you're really upset about it, and you write an op-ed piece, what are the chances? Well, once in a while you might get a hit, get it published. Try to change the talk from causes to changing thresholds. Because if we could change the talk to changing thresholds, then we have a little bit more hope that we could do something about these kinds of things. And that goes with respect to a whole range of problems in human behavior. Crime of various dimensions, all sorts of behavior. The other thing about it is it feeds or it ties right into the way we think about the way behavior works. The common everyday talk is about causes. Well, there's two problems with talk about causes. The standard 4 Aristotelian causes, which I won't bother to try to run off to you because I might forget one of them, actually don't have within them this different causal mode that Skinner talked about when he introduced the business of selection by consequences. Remember we talked about selection once. And that talk of causes then, there was no particular cause of the long neck of the giraffe. There was a whole set of environmental histories that came together to produce giraffes. There was another set of environmental histories that came together to do something that made us verbal, and that brought us to the point where we were all together here. So the language of causes has problems in that dimension. It also has a problem because you tend to then focus on one thing as if it was, just this billiard ball hitting that billiard board that made something happen. But look at this example. If you go if it's lunchtime and you go into the fast food place and you're standing there at the counter, you're not going to place an order if there's nobody behind the counter to take it. So somebody being there as your audience is going to be one possible contributor to whether you say something. You wouldn't be there except it was lunchtime. So these establishing conditions, whatever we talk about, whether you want to call them establishing operations, motivational operations, brings you there at that place at that time. There's a menu there, and there are words in the menu, and to some extent your verbal behavior in saying something when you see the word, we call that textual behavior, is another thing that's going to contribute to your saying things. If you particularly like this salad, or you like this burger, or whatever the other thing. Or if you hear somebody else just having ordered the same thing and you've heard it, you're likely to repeat it. That's echoic behavior. Or if you actually see this, that somebody else has just gotten at the neighboring line and seeing it and naming it as part of it. All of these things are going to come together. And as you know, in a restaurant, or if you folks are sitting around with other people placing orders, the orders that other people are placing are going to affect which thing you're going to order some of the time. None of this has a single cause. They all come together to produce what you happen to do at that time. And that is generally a property of behavior. And yet we don't incorporate that enough into our interpretations of what happens in the world out there when we try to do what Pat Fryman again recommends we do, and is to talk more in the common everyday language about what we do. But we shouldn't buy into the everyday ways of making distinctions like the causal language. And then there's the circular reasoning we always have to worry about. And this comes into the sorts of things that, again, Pat was talking about. We talk about people as doing things because they have attitudes. Well, how do we know somebody has an attitude? We know they've been behaving in certain ways. Once we see them behaving in this way with respect to something, we say they have an attitude toward that thing. Whether it's toward people who are racially or ethnically dissimilar from them, or whether it's with respect to gender or whatever, People have their attitudes, or whether somebody speaks to them respectfully or disrespect, all these kinds of things. Then we see them behaving in that way, and somebody says, why did that person do that? Oh, that person did it because he just has an attitude. And we walk away and we're satisfied. Now we've got the reason. It's been explained to us. We buy that kind of thing. It's all around us. If you look at psychology stuff that gets picked up by the mass media, and they talk about what psychologists have now found out about human behavior, very often the explanation in the bottom turns out to be giving a name that arose from just looking at this kind of behavior as it goes on. Don't buy it. We can do better than that. We should be talking about different kinds of things. And it also holds with respect to the language of emotions, you know. Is anger a cause of behavior? Why did you do that? Well, because you made me angry. Is that an explanation? Anger is a word that we learned as a name to apply when we see somebody behaving in a certain way. So if we ourselves come to behave in that way, and then we say, I did it because I was angry, all we're doing is throwing out a name for something and throwing it out as if it was an explanation. We're shortchanging ourselves. As behavior analysts, we can do better than that. Skinner had this marvelous demonstration once. It was a video. He had two pigeons, and they were trained each with different feeders. One of them had a feeder with a sort of a thing that was a vertical thing, and the pigeon could just push up against it, and that would operate this pigeon's feeder, and that would only work when a light came on here. So when this light came on, the pigeon would go push up against that thing and get to eat. The other pigeon had to step on a treadle when that pigeon's light came on over here, and that pigeon. So these, you could reinforce the behavior of either pigeon independently. But what he did was, pigeon A, pigeon B. If pigeon B starts moving toward A, he differentially reinforces pecks on A. And then by turning on the light and letting this pigeon go to its feeder. But he does that only when the overhead light is green. So in the presence of green, you've got a pecking order. Pigeon A's pecking on B is reinforced. And what does pigeon A do? Pigeon A's feathers come up, and pigeon B collapses and gets in this. And pigeon A is down there collapsed, and pigeon B is worked on. But then, in the presence of the red light, he has reinforced pecks of A on B. So you change the color of the light, and suddenly pigeon A, who's down there is the submission bottom of the pecking order pigeon, the light changes, and now this is the stimulus in the presence of which its pecks on B have been reinforced, and suddenly, whoof! And B, who's there in the aggressive posture, its feathers collapse, and the pecking order is reversed. Now, have you ever been in one of those situations where you've gotten into a really hot fight with some friend or colleague or something, and somebody like a faculty member or a supervisor or somebody you really respect walks into the room, and suddenly everything is sweetness and light? Are you going to tell me that's not operant behavior? Are you going to tell me that's all elicited stuff, and once you're angry, it's this thing that's elicited and you can't control it? Hell no. Most of the time, just like you can live in the world of the green light or the red light. By the way, he also had a white light during which pecks of neither on the other was reinforced. And in that case, the two birds just went over to their respective corners, and it was truce time. But that behavior is behavior that is subject to contingencies, and like other kinds of behavior, yes, there are kinds of events that will elicit that sort of thing, and we have to respect that and understand it. But a lot of it can be brought under operant control. So don't buy the argument of, why did you do that? Well, I did it because you made me angry. We got to counter those kinds of accounts of where behavior comes from, because they're at the heart of a lot of the things that happen when you get the sorts of interactions that we see when we worry about discrimination, prejudice, and all of these kinds of things. The far out militants who would like to change the world around would say they're being upset by all of these things that are happening in the world. The causes are different. The contingencies are different. Okay, well, so we've talked about conditional discriminations as a way to address some effects of discrimination. We've talked about, say, the inner city versus the university as a way in which you can have conditional discriminations that might become the little starting places where stuff can be created that will gradually spread out into the culture. Can these enclaves be the hubs from which things spread? But then again, you also have to worry about isolated communities as ones in which other problems go on. If you have a community in which people will only speak to other people if they speak in certain ways, certain big mega churches, for example, in which you are essentially shunned unless you speak in certain ways, then you're going to have essentially a vicious circle of reinforcement maintaining certain kinds of verbal behavior that will maintain the practices that go along with them. And then you've also got to worry about the unintended consequences of different kinds of things. The country has a nasty history of residential segregation. If you're interested in finding out about that, there's a book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, which documents how what were supposed to be plans for desegregated housing turned out to be massively segregated back in the 40s and the 50s and maybe even in the 30s. But you know, one can work toward desegregated housing, and the trouble is that there are other kinds of things that happen. If you have even tiny preferences, this is a kind of thing you can look at in computer simulations. Let's suppose you have a neighborhood with housing in it, and people are moving into it, and the only thing that they ask is they're going to have, if they're in the middle and it's also a grid, and they're going to have 8 people living around them, all they ask is that at least one of their neighbors is like them, okay? As long as they have at least one neighbor who looks like them, they're going to be happy. They don't mind being next to somebody else who's different. And now you move people in, and what happens as you do this is you keep trying to relocate people if they end up being unhappy because they don't have that one neighbor who's similar to them. And it turns out that if you start with as simple a preference as that, you end up getting segregated areas. So if you're going to try to create desegregated areas, you really got to work hard at it. You've got to counteract these kinds of problems that are contingencies that don't come about because of people saying, oh, no, I won't be close to those people. No, simple preferences like that can create difficulties. Even if you're actively seeking diversity, you can run up against various kinds of hurdles. Unintended consequences hide around every corner. So that is a thing that people have to know about, because if they're going to work to move in this direction, they've got to know the problems that they might run into. And now we're ready to talk about verbal behavior, and I'm going to give you a 5-minute summary because that's about the time we got left. And we'll close off with that. Okay, and in this closing, what I was going to do was talk about 4 major functional things that happens in verbal behavior that makes it so powerful that once you introduce it, you can run into problems, okay? First of all, by its very nature, verbal behavior involves replication. And by that, I don't just mean that you say what you heard said or you write what you heard read. I'm not talking about the Skinner's formal classes of echoic behavior. I'm talking about replication in general. You can hear something and then write it down. You can read something and then say it. Verbal behavior tends to repeat itself. Now, some of that's great. We now recreate every time we read through one of Skinner's books or papers, or every time we read Darwin, or we recreate some verbal behavior that started a long time ago, and some of which has helped us to get to where we are. But just the fact that we can create it is what keeps the verbal behavior going, so it can feed upon itself and get repeated. And once you get people repeating stuff like throw her in jail or other kinds of lines, and it gets repeated often enough, it can become built into the system and be hard to break free of. But that's just one little bit. What are some of the other things that happen with verbal behavior? We tend to think of words, these are the instruments of reason. We humans are great because we can talk. And by talking, boy, I can do that. Boy, I can thump my, wow. We tend not to think of this verbal behavior as we think of every other kind of behavior. But verbal behavior can be shaped. And if somebody tells a lot of lies, and every time that person tells lies, a whole bunch of people applaud it, then those lies have been reinforced, and they will occur more often. Verbal behavior can be shaped, and it has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with reason. In fact, if one could find a contingency so that every time somebody lied, something bad happened. Gee, I could imagine maybe doing something like every time somebody lied, people gave money to a progressive group. I mean, would that change lying? Who knows? That would be an interesting contingency. Make lying cost. But anyway, verbal behavior can be shaped. And if it can be shaped, then you could probably get people saying any damn thing. And if you have a community of people who are neo-Nazis, and they talk mainly to each other, and they reinforce each other's verbal behavior, and they can shape ever more extreme statements, you can have stuff careening off to really, really strange kind of political behavior. Third thing, once you shape verbal behavior, if it's verbal behavior concerned with what you do, then you will tend, once the verbal behavior is shaped, to do it. So if I'm working with some students, or I'm working with a child, and the child is pressing buttons, and I get the kid to say, oh, the way I make this one work is to press it fast, and the way I make this one work is to press it slow, and I get the kid to say that, that's what the kid will start to do. Press this one fast, press that one slow. Shape verbal behavior about behavior produces corresponding behavior. That's involved with verbal governance. If you want to get people to do things, don't bother shaping it directly. Shape what they say. You're more likely actually to be successful. And so now you've got verbal behavior being replicated. It's being shaped as it gets repeated, so it's changing the repetitions. And then if you're getting people to talk about what they're going to do, it's influencing what they do. What every politician wants to do is to shape the following behavior in the audiences. I will vote for you. If you can shape that verbal behavior, you're going to get a lot of it. I would like to, well, yeah, okay. Fourth, once you've got this thing going, if it's correlated with reinforcers, if these are the people talking to you who are correlated with other kinds of social reinforcers, then you're going to have what we spent an earlier time talking about, which is differential attention. And once you have differential attention, then you're going to attend to this stuff more than you attend to the other stuff. Like if you're tied into this political viewpoint, then you're going to spend more time attending to that than to the ones that disagree with you. And so you're going to have more and more isolation that's exaggerated by this. So you start wheeling, each of these things feeds the others. And you have this cycle of things which can actually create bodies of verbal behavior that virtually come free from having connections with the world, except in small social or sometimes larger social contingencies. That can create political differences, it can create social differences. And part of that, once it's based solely on verbal behavior, that is when the term prejudice really comes into effect. Because you have to be carefully taught to hate all the people your relatives hate. That song, by the way, from South Pacific, when South Pacific first appeared after World War II, it was banned. It couldn't be performed in some of the states in the South because it was anti-American. And that's because it had an interracial love relationship within it in the South Pacific story. So there was that thing we look about. South Pacific is this real American classic. Well, there is that one incredible song in it, You Have to Be Carefully Taught, which was a blockbuster, but also this other thing, to think of that as having been banned as un-American when it first came out is a bit of a shocker when I discovered it. So we have a science. We have a science that includes in it stimulus control or the topic of discrimination. Hey, I introduced myself and talked about this stuff. I took Nat Schoenfeld's course, the first semester of Nat Schoenfeld's experimental course in experimental psychology was called Discrimination. I didn't know that my history working in New York City and living in New York City would ever matter with respect to that. I do have a little bit of expertise. I got an A in Nat's course. I got an A in discrimination. Please don't hold that against me. I want to say that our science is building in a way in which we can take these things and maybe we can begin to use it to make sense of some of the things that go on and do something with it to make the world a better place. Thank you. She's got something you folks will want to hear. And then I can take some questions.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, just a couple friendly reminders. Remember, anyone seeking social work CEUs must sign in and out daily at the registration desk. Don't forget to complete an evaluation for this session. If you use the Groupio app, this is session 9. And our code for the session, GET 158. Get 158. And really quickly, if you're interested in purchasing the book that we talked about earlier, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis, please feel free to contact the publisher and let them know that you were at the National Autism Conference. Up next is the BACB updates, and that will begin around 4:15 in President's Halls 1, 2, and 3. So, thank you again.
I would like to take, we have a little time, I'd like to take questions, because
Okay.
I haven't done this kind of presentation much. I really like to get the audience's reactions and would like to hear from the folks out there. So,
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or stand up.
Of touching their hair. So for him, if you could keep that hand covered in some way so he couldn't get to the skin, the reinforcer is in the sensation that he experiences as he bites, then you might lose interest in that behavior. But this is not an area of
I've been asked to repeat the questions, and I'm a little embarrassed by this. He essentially said it was amazing, so what can I say? Thank you. But that wasn't a question, was it?
Just wondering if you could share one of the most
I think you
influential
have to
texts in your
I
career
think we all
book,
have to work on it.
and then a book recommendation you might have for the audience following your
I sort
presentation
of don't want this to be
today.
a promotion for but I do have a chapter on this kind of material, and a couple of things here are drawn from figures in the book. Do I have it? Do you want me to put it up on the screen?
Well, I recommend a book by Ed
I can.
Christopherson called Treatments for Children That Work. And there's
Whoops.
a section on anxiety in that book.
Let's see.
And also a section on
Hang on for
incontinence,
just a
section
second
on
here.
ADHD, a section on
Well, anyway, this
disruptive behavior and
I don't know what's happened here. Something peculiar is.
a useful practical.
Oh well. Anyway,
Ed Christopherson.
this stuff is no longer relevant. Let me just turn this off so you're not distracted by that. I think I mentioned to you that I started doing this in the classroom, and I found that it was usually well received. But in all of the times that I did it up to fairly recent times, I had never extended it to the verbal stuff. So in this particular text, I realized that I had the opportunity, writing a thing that was a little bit different from what I've done before. So I decided I want to take a shot at writing a chapter about these kinds of issues. So in that book, there's one chapter called Discrimination, the introductory part of which introduces, as an example, when you're a jet and you're walking down the street, you can make it a jet or a shark, whichever you want. you will inevitably discriminate among the members of your own gang and the members of the other gang, just as inevitably as the pigeon will discriminate green versus red. And I started this, so that there's a section there, and then there's a whole chapter on prejudice and later in the book. And it's my first shot at actually trying to write this stuff out. And I think of this not only as a way to get the stuff out there, but as a way of thinking about getting this stuff out to a broader audience. I have these fantasies about being able to write something like this for, say, a magazine like the New Yorker or something. But, you know, it's hard as hell to get accepted in these national media things. I mean, they accept one tiny fraction of the stuff that's submitted there. But if the timing is right and if people spread this around, that's good enough for me. If people are going to run with it, and it's virtually certain that many of you, if you start worrying about these issues, will come with other things to think about that will be helpful and other ways to spread it around. And that's all I can ask. I mean, all of what I've done over the years depended upon this course in which these two guys, Fred Keller and Nat Schoenfeld, had produced an undergraduate curriculum based on the work by this one individual named B.F. Skinner. And Keller taught the first course. I became fascinated by that. Nat was teaching experimental psych, took me under his wing. And at that point, there was not a point at which I eventually had to make a decision as to what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I was caught up by this stuff and ran with it. But, you know, I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been lucky enough to just get there at that time with them. And everything else, I can identify all kinds of choice points in which I could have gone very different ways. So what each of us have done, and so there are two people, well, actually a small number of people started a thing in which by the time you look further on, they've got hundreds of people doing this stuff. And now you come in this one place. What is it, 1,400 people, 1,600 people, some large, just here, and that's just in this state at this time, and you've got all the other organization and institutions, and that's not even counting. We do have, I understand we have international visitors, but you know, there are more behavior analysts in Brazil than there are in the United States, because Fred Keller went down there and started a program when the University of Brasilia was just being started. So for each of us, we have this privilege of at least doing more than we can do on our own one-on-one because we spread it to other people. And so I'm just happy with that. So keep up the good work. It's ours. It's not, you know, any one person's. It's ours. This is our science. Yes.
Earlier your talk mentioned some of the discrimination between like Hayes' use of the word frames versus Skinner's use of the word frames, and like I guess you never like came back around to it. So is there any like emphasis on like Hayes' interpretation of moral behaviors versus Skinner's, or is it more
Okay.
like is it, or is he just like saying similar stuff that was mentioned?
Okay, the question is about Steve Hayes' use of the word frames in his relational frame stuff and Skinner's use of the word frames in the book Verbal Behavior. The book Verbal Behavior is, I think, available in various ways so that you can get a downloaded PDF copy in which you can actually do searches, and you can search for every instance of the word frame. And so the question was about, is there really a difference between the way Hayes uses the word frames in his relational frame theory and the way Skinner used the word frames? Well, you can't blame Skinner for not getting in all of these possible ways in which you could study this stuff. He was getting started. He was trying this stuff out, and his verbal behavior was evolving. His presentation on verbal behavior when he gave the William James lectures in 1949 was very different than as he brought it out in the book in 1957. And then he supplemented it with later papers like The Listener and so forth. But the frames was his way of talking about bigger classes. It was his way of talking about novel instances, how the child could come to say a sentence the child had never heard before, but if that sentence had that same grammatical structure as, so if the child has learned to say the dogs run and the birds fly, there's no great mystery about the kid being able to say the fish swim, you know, because that set of relationships between the nouns and the verbs is the same across all of these kinds of things. And yet that was the kind of thing that linguists like Chomsky claimed we couldn't talk about. So Skinner has that. If you trace it out in Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, it occurs at various places. Steve has gotten, I'll call him Steve. I've known Steve Hayes for long. In fact, Steve Hayes spent the academic year 74, 75, again dating myself. He took a sabbatical and spent it at UMBC, working with me and with my colleague Elliot Chimoff and with a visitor from Norway named Terje Sagfolden. We were just beginning to do the stuff on shaping verbal behavior and looking at the corresponding nonverbal stuff when Steve was there as a visitor. I have been bothered by the relational frames stuff because even though Steve will say it should be a verb, it should be framing, it always comes back to talking about the frames and many of the people who are writing about it. And so for me, it looks more like a structural description of relationships among things than a process that's concerned with the contingencies. Crucial pieces in that history are a major paper written by Pauline Horn and Fergus Lowe from the University of North Wales, in which they contrast Hayes' frames with other ways of talking about acquisitions of classes, in which the class they were interested in was the class called naming. Skinner had this thing called tacting, which in the presence of the stimulus you say the word, and it was supposed to displace this whole language of reference which gets directions wrong. But naming, naming was the wrong word for it, because naming can occur even if the stimulus is absent. And what they tried to do was to show the different things that have to be in place for a child to be set for naming. Well, the child has to be able to look at a thing pointed to, not look at the person pointing, but look at the thing pointed to. The child has to be able to echo the words when you hear it, so that if the parent says, this is a shoe, the child will look at the shoe, repeat the word shoe, and later will now be able to say the word shoe as a tact when you show the kid a shoe. Once you've got a few instances of that, you've got a thing where it's a generalized class and you plug any new word in there with a new object and you have this explosion of vocabulary. And it's totally consistent with what happens to the vocabularies of kids in those ages between 2 and 4. I mean, the kids' vocabularies are expanding thousands of words a year. But if you've got a class like that already in place, well, Skinner, I think, anticipated that in his discussions of framing. I don't see that. In fact, too many of the experiments on relational framing that I've seen in the literature are ones in which the people doing it don't even tap what's already in the repertory, where the framing experiments include stimuli that are common stimuli. You should first do the pretest in which you check these stimuli out. So I guess you're beginning to tell that I have a jaded view of that stuff. But nevertheless, I've got to alert you to the fact there are probably more people following Steve right now than are following behavior analysis within the Association for Behavior Analysis. I don't know where that's going to go.
Like clarifying, it's not so much the fact that it's like it's all consistent like behaviorally, but the fact that people are taking stuff like using it kind of as a structural thing, like these are frames and stuff.
Yeah, well, I frankly, I know that there was a workshop devoted to relational frame theory at the end of the last ABA meeting, which I didn't attend, which was in San Diego in May. The question was how frames are being used. But apparently a lot of it is to address to people who want to do various kinds of therapeutic interventions. Now, at the level of clinical stuff, framing is involved with changing verbal behavior. And if you can change equivalence classes and all, and if you know that you can shape verbal behavior, I think you've got a charismatic guy who's using some things we know about and relabeling stuff and running with it. But I think a lot of our folks can do similar kinds of things if they really wanted to get down to it. that's my reaction to it at this stage of the game. So, but thank you. The question here, yeah.
Sort of piggybacking off that, you mentioned a little bit earlier some of the limitations within the stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory, particularly when those are written up, they always talk about how bidirectional it is, and then you sort of segued almost into the pecking order that you don't always know, you don't always respond the same to all of the involved stimuli. And I found that a lot in the students that I work with, that it's not always bidirectional.
Okay, yeah. Okay, the question was about the directionality in framing, and it was sort of a follow-up on the earlier questions. Correct me, am I getting it right so far? And once you've got this language of equivalence classes, it's almost as if you've made everything in these classes substitutable for everything else. But it turns out that if you have A related to B, and B related to C, and C related to D, and D related to E, and so forth, so you finally get out to X or Y, no, they are not all going to be exactly interchangeable. The more nodes they're separated by, the more likely you are to have inconsistencies beginning to develop. And so what you need is, maybe there are structural ways to talk about that. And in fact, Lanny Field's work has particularly been concerned with the number of nodes separating the different terms in these frames. So we're beginning to learn something about that. But that is, again, appealing to structure and not for the history of creation of the relations. So again, it's sort of like this magic stuff. Once you've created this equivalence, everything is going to fall into place. No, the examples like the one of the Mickey Keenan's experiment in Northern Ireland and the kinds of things you mentioned where you find that actually they're not really, once you get the equivalence class, you don't always find that all of the terms work as well as all of the others, is telling us that we still have more to work on to understand how these classes get put together, what the constraints are. That may be a structural thing that will depend on properties of the stimuli, or maybe it'll have to do with ways we create it. Ways we create verbal behavior can really make a difference. And I'm going to switch to a slightly different topic just to make the point. There are lots of people who try to teach, say, abstinence in various kinds of clinical settings. And if you talk to the folks who've developed abstinence things, there are people who have all these stages of abstinence, and you go through stage 1, stage 2. But one of the common features that go through all of this is that you have some people who present stuff to the person who wants to, say, quit smoking or abstain from some other kind of, from something else. Very little attention is given to the mode in which you present these things to the, so you could simply tell a client what to do and have them repeat it after you, or you can let the client start to talk about it and you can shape what the client says. If you're really good, you can get the client to say the thing that this other thing would give the client in a brochure. My guess is that if you shape the verbal behavior, that you're far more likely to get appropriate behavior following from it, or consistent than if you just tell somebody about stuff or you give them stuff that describes it without their having engaged in that verbal behavior for start. Because every time we've done this kind of stuff in the laboratory, if you shape what a kid's saying, if you shape what a college student is saying, if you shape what an adult is saying, you are very, very likely to get them to behave in a way that's equivalent to what they're now come to be saying. But if you tell them what to say, you don't know what to expect. So if you're working on those kinds of things, always look at not what you're saying to the child or to your client or whatever. Look at what the child is saying, and then remember that whatever the child is saying, you can shape. You can use reinforcement. If the child's saying things that you think are going to lead in bad ways, don't reinforce that. But if the child is ever moving the talk in a way that you think is a good thing, reinforce the hell out of it. You know. So I don't know whether that's okay. Any other comments? Any things that you think I could change about what I've been talking about? Any? My email address. If you got my last name, Catania, and you know from this stuff that my affiliation is UMBC, Catania@umbc.edu. If you come up with anything about this in which you think of something you wish I had said, or something that bothered you, something that you think could be fixed, anything that you think could improve it, send me an email. I won't promise that I can deal with all of it. My email inbox is always too full, and if I read it, if there's sometimes a time period goes by and I don't look at it all, the stuff that's 3 days old might get buried. So if you write to me and I don't answer, just write again and say I didn't get an answer. I will try to answer everybody. Okay, but I would welcome things for sharpening these arguments up, for making it better, for making it easier to find ways to introduce it and get it out there to a broader audience. And I really thank you for your attention. I'll pay attention to your comments.